Your story right now is not your final story. I think that for me is huge. There's more story to tell. When you think you're at the end, there is more story, and we have every right to rewrite that story as often as we want.
Welcome to the Storycraft podcast for storytellers. I'm your host, Meg Adams, and I'm here to help you explore how stories shape our connections. Wondering how stories help you network and advance? Looking to bridge online and face-to-face worlds, foster understanding, and ignite innovation? Look no further. Whether you're a leader, communicator, educator, or just love a good story, join us for actionable insights and real talk with professional storytellers, all aimed at helping you build stronger, better connections. Hello, welcome to another episode of the Storycraft podcast. I'm so excited to be joined with Dr. Natasha Williams. She is a clinical psychologist, so I am very excited to speak with her on how storytelling has informed her career and work. And so we're going to dig right in, Dr. Natasha, not waste anybody's time, but I'm so curious to know, and I'm going to let you tell us a little bit of your story, your background story, how you became a clinical psychologist, and the role that storytelling plays in your work.
Yes. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited. So as you mentioned, I am a clinical psychologist. I've been a psychologist now for approximately 18 years. I got into the field, to be very honest, at 13 is when I knew that I wanted to be a psychologist. And part of my story was that my mother passed away 2 weeks before I started high school. She was not a psychologist, but I wanted to look for a career that embodied a lot of whom she was. She immigrated here with my father from the Commonwealth of Dominica, became a clerical worker, but it was always how she represented herself and how the community saw her. So she was almost like a layperson psychologist in a sense. And then she embodied so much strength and stuff like that. So I knew at 13 I looked for those types of professions and I said, this is where I'm going to land. And I just basically went on that trajectory ever since, doing my undergrad, my master's, my doctorate, and then becoming registered as a psychologist. So yeah, in my profession now, I've been in private practice now for again over 18 years. We have a clinic called Allied Psychological Services in the Toronto area, where I'm one of the clinical directors. We have another location in Oakville, Ontario, so just outside of Toronto as well. And a lot of what we do is assessment, psychotherapy, clinical consultation, supervision. So a lot of those aspects as well. But yeah, storytelling, I think, when we look at what we do as clinicians, and the one aspect that we do as psychologists is psychotherapy, the storytelling of the client is such a powerful tool, and it's definitely something that I think is very important in terms of their journey to healing.
You sort of led right into my next question, Dr. Natasha, which was, and it's a it's a broad question, but what role does storytelling have to play in mental health?
Mm. So I think what's interesting is that with mental illness, because there's a difference between mental health and mental illness. A lot of times in mental illness, if we really can conceptualize it, it is a story that either has been told
Mm.
to the client, and what happens is now that client embodies that story for themselves, regardless of how deficient that story may be. So a lot of times what we look at is when we're looking at things like anxiety, depression, trauma, we start to really look at what is their core belief and how did that core belief come about. And usually core beliefs come from a place of upbringing. How was their upbringing? And that's part of it, but just wanting to give a very simple
Sure.
response. But it's looking at that upbringing and what stories have been told or things that they have learned about themselves, about others, about the world, and about the future. And those stories then embody whom they are, and that's their foundation. What we aim to do as psychologists is understand that foundation, where it came from, and do we have to restory? Right? So a
Yeah.
lot of times we've held on to these scripts for so long, it becomes what we believe is our normal, but a lot of times it manifests into psychopathology or a lot of different symptomatology, which doesn't help the client. It ends up causing dysfunction. So how do we look at those core beliefs? Look at where they came from. Do we have to restory, or what some psychologists will do in the framework of cognitive behavioral therapy is what we call cognitive restructuring. So how do we restructure them so that we're actually seeing them from a place of more truth and the client's truth versus what they were fed, which might be coming from a place of untruth, or it came from literally stories. If we talk about transgenerational trauma, stories that have been superimposed from generation to generation.
Thank you for that lovely explanation of how storytelling plays into mental health. So for listeners who may be self-aware,
Mm,
or they might be able to understand, maybe they're not in therapy, or maybe they are, but maybe they know that there are some stories that aren't serving them. Do
mm,
you have any advice for helping them to, as you mentioned, restory,
right.
their lives? Because as you mentioned, that really does, we do embody those stories, and then that affects not just our behavior, but the way that we treat others in community as well.
Absolutely. The first thing I do want to mention to people that either might not be in therapy or whatever
Mhm.
the case may be is a lot of times those stories and those narratives served them at a point in time.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
Right? So I
Yeah.
want to mention that as well. So
Mhm.
it's not to be upset or frustrated with self that you've held on to these stories for a certain period
Yeah.
of time. They may have been helpful in terms of you coping with
Mhm.
trauma back in the day, or just to cope with, very unfortunate circumstances as you were growing up. So they actually helped along the way. Quite possibly. Not everyone's
Yeah.
story is the same, but wanted to be mindful of that. So
Sure.
when we get now to present day and understanding that, this is no longer serving me, these stories and scripts are no longer serving me. That's where we have every right to say to ourselves as a starting point, this may have helped me, but it doesn't help me now. And now I am the agent of what is going to help me going forward. So it's being able to really let go of what was, serving us in the past. But I think also as part of the restoring, we also have to look at who was telling us the story,
Mm.
because sometimes we put our parents or whomever was giving us that initial script on such a pedestal that what happens is that that story has to be true, right? And it has to be real. But it was my mother, it was my father, it was this person of authority, and we're now here to say they were only giving from possibly their lack or their deficiency, which means it doesn't have to be your portion any longer, that we can then create our own story that's going to serve ourselves. So it's being able to even feel that you are capable, willing, and able to actually embark on that journey. Then you have every right to do so.
Yeah, that's a beautiful, like you said, kind of starting point. Once you are aware of what that maybe limiting story is in your life. Do you have any practical tips for people to kind of work through that restoring? Like maybe
Mm,
they're like, again, for the person who's in the position of, I understand this story isn't serving me anymore. How do they move forward? How do they create a new
mhm.
story?
Yeah, so that's actually where a lot of the work comes in,
Yeah.
right? Right. So it's usually not just one tool. I know, for example, if we use the tenets of cognitive behavioral therapy, we
Hmm.
call it cognitive restructuring, but we talk about, evidence, almost like as a lawyer in and of
Yeah.
itself. So what is evidence that this thought is true and real, and what is evidence that it's not? A lot of times we hold on to stories because we hold on to the evidence that we believe that it is true, and completely negating everything else. So
Hmm.
part of the process is now saying, yes, this doesn't serve me anymore, but why do I believe that this is so true? Right? And what evidence am I not seeing
Hmm.
that could actually, disprove what is happening here? The other thing that we would do ourselves is I usually call it poking holes in the theory. And what that means basically is that we may be revering the source of the initial story in such a regard that we have to start now understanding why. Why do I have this particular person on a pedestal Why is it that that particular person or persons, whatever that they're saying is true? So it's now trying to say it, and it's not trying to say I'm going to completely discredit my mother or completely discredit my father or something, but then it's being able to say they were giving me what they had. They may also been coming from a place of trauma, and that's what impacted the stories that they told me, right? Sometimes it's your partner, or if you're coming out of a really bad relationship, why do I revere that partner in such high regard in terms of what they were saying about me?
Mhm.
They're also then coming from a place of lack. So it's being able to start poking holes in that there. And that's what a psychologist in particular would do with different, techniques. We have things called evidence records and those
Mhm.
kinds of things where we look at, here's your thought. This is why it's so, what we call a hot thought. This is the thought that seems to be really salient and emotional for you. Let's start to break this down and say, where's the evidence that this thought is actually real and true? And where's the evidence that you might be neglecting that actually is, discredits this thought? And then what we aim to do is to restory with
Mhm.
all of this evidence, evidence for and evidence against. How do we restory? And what I usually call it is a balanced thought. And that's just meaning that it's not saying you're going from all negative to all positive, but I'm taking everything into consideration and I'm looking at it from a balanced perspective.
I love the idea of balance. And it
Yes.
made me, as you were talking, it made me think of another question about how we create our stories. It sounds like there's a theme of other people, like their stories, their experiences, especially as you mentioned, people who are authorities in our lives or are people that we trust and love. They often have this impact. And as you mentioned, they themselves are human beings with their stories going on in their heads and acting out in the world.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so, yeah, do you have any advice for people to kind of stay, as you said, sort of true to that inner who they are, their
Mhm.
individual perspective or story experiences?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that piece is the toughest part because a
Mm.
lot of times we believe that that voice is ours because
Yeah.
I've heard it for so long that
Mm.
now it almost turns into my voice. So, as an example, if you have a parent that keeps on saying, you're no good, you're not good enough, and that kind of thing, as you start to hear that so often, it almost turns into your voice where you're like,
Mhm.
oh, I am not good enough. So sometimes we have that difficulty deciphering between, where did the source of this even come from?
Mhm.
Um, I find a lot of times, again, where the restoring comes in is that, we start to talk about a whole notion of self-worth and having that ability to pick up and say, you are more than what was said to you. And
Mm.
it's being able to believe that you are worthy enough for that. Again, easier said than done, but that's where we have to start
Absolutely.
breaking down some of those messages
Mhm.
and really poking the holes so that you can now say, I am more than what was said to me. Right? Being able to say, no, 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 these theories are actually not accurate. There might be places in my life where I believed it to be true, but what am I neglecting?
Mm.
A lot of times there'll be like, and when we look at restoring, we also look at words. That's the other thing I also wanted to bring into
I
account
love
because a
that.
lot of times the scripts that we tell ourselves or the stories that we tell ourselves, we look at the words like always. It happens all the time, those type of very absolute types of terms where that's where as a psychologist, when you start to hear those words, you listen to phrases and listen to words and saying, that seems very absolute or, happens all the time. Are there times when this actually is not absolute or is it really all the time? So being able to poke those types of holes where
Mm.
now you're actually starting to change their script.
Yes. Yeah. I love that's lovely. Yeah, like you said, I never had occurred to me to think about the specific language that you use when you're either telling a story or listening to a story. But that,
Yes.
yeah, what a great piece of advice there for us to all sort of become more aware of the stories that we're telling ourselves. And of course, this could be on the flip side. I always win. I'm always the best, right?
Yes, yes. And it's even comes like with notions of even perfection, I find. Same
Yeah.
thing as
Yeah.
well. It's like I need to be perfect all the time, I always have to get 100% or,
Mhm.
but again, a lot of times those things, those aspects or ways of thinking, those stories served them back then. I had
Right.
a client, just as a quick example, I had a client where For her, achieving as she was growing up, achieving in school and getting 100% meant that her mother wouldn't verbally abuse her.
Hmm.
Right. So, I mean, this is an extreme example. It's a client that I had a long time ago, but that behavior then served her. So then what she did, and I mean, it's maladaptive, but because again, there's no such thing as perfection. There is going to be at some point where you're not getting 100%.
Right. Yeah.
But for her at the time, it was a protective factor. I'm going to stay at school as much as I can. I'm going to study as hard as I can because anything less than 100%, I know that I'm going to be, verbally abused by my mother. So that was her coping strategy going through. Now, unfortunately, it no longer served her because as an adult and as a professor and all of those types of things, she was never doing anything good enough. So she used that then as a place of self-punishment.
Love what you're hearing on this podcast? Consider booking me to speak at your next event. Dive further into the transformative power of storytelling with my keynote. Tell better stories, speak up, stand out, and build community. In a world that often amplifies our differences, my talk invites you to embrace genuine connections. Break free from the echo chambers and discover the art of storytelling. Learn how to share your own narrative, listen actively, and foster communities that flourish on shared experiences. Check out the show notes to learn more about how to book a talk for your next event. I'm using this podcast as well for research and really looking into how stories help us connect to other individuals. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how sharing our stories, and by stories, I mean those raw, honest stories that perhaps you're sharing with patients, right? How does that help us, from your perspective, connect as individuals and build communities?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I usually find that it's in the sharing of the stories that provides normalcy. And I don't think a lot of people recognize that. And that's where the connection comes in. When I know that I'm not the only one and that someone else has a similar story to me, that actually deepens the connection. What we've noticed, especially as clinicians, when we look at individual therapy, but even the power of group psychotherapy. That's where you notice the sharing of stories can be a very powerful thing, where if I was in isolation or I was, suffering in silence, just had a lot of these symptoms, being able to be in a group setting and starting to share those stories, you're like, oh my God, I'm not the only one. There's others that are dealing with this as well. I now feel connected to this person as a result. So you have that ability to now share and then put it outside of yourself. Because a lot of times it's in the silence and the shame where you'll notice the intensity of psychological symptoms, right? Where you're able to now start to share and understand that there is no shame in that. That's where the healing starts to ensue. So it's so important to able to make those connections, but to take out the shame and the stigma of those things so that you're able to then story and make connection. Connection is actually quite healing because when we look at some symptoms like symptoms for depression and those kinds of things, it's symptoms such as the low mood, but the social isolation and those kinds of things that entrench depression as an example. So being able to story and connect is where you'll notice, a change in the intensity of the symptoms.
Do you find that patients in group therapy, or maybe again, people who might not be in like a psychological setting,
Mm,
do you have any advice in terms of getting vulnerable enough to share their story? Because that's a really tough thing to do.
mm,
Because I think for what you're saying, for that to work,
yeah.
you have to be willing to be
Yes.
that vulnerable to share that sometimes the
Yeah.
rawest pieces of your story and yourself.
That's very true. And the interesting thing with vulnerability is not an easy thing, right? And it's funny. And a lot of times, you'll hear, being vulnerable is actually the strength, right? Being able to say that I'm allowed my humanness, I'm
Mm.
allowed to be a human being, is actually one of the most powerful places to be in, but it's not the easiest place to get to. Many times vulnerability is also looking at what we call safe space or psychological safe space. And that's what we do in terms of even if we look at one-to-one therapy, or even when I do things from an employee or corporate standpoint, it's the employer that would, have to create an environment in which an employee would feel even safe enough to say, I am struggling, I am having some issues, versus feeling that they're going to be reprimanded or chastised as a result. So the vulnerability is tough. And it takes time to foster the environment in which you would feel safe. And sometimes, you may feel safe with one person because they, over the years, have shown that they are a safe space. Or again, if we're looking at even from a corporate standpoint, with a lot of the training that I do corporately, it's being able to tell the employer, the more you create a psychologically healthy space, you're going to have a more productive work environment, as an example. So vulnerability and psychological safe space, I find, go hand in hand. I'm not going to be vulnerable if I don't necessarily feel safe that it's going to be received in a certain way.
Do you have any advice for leaders, especially whether that's corporate, organizationally, to create psychologically safe spaces so that, because as you mentioned, and I think as we've hopefully people who are listening to this podcast are already bought into the fact that, storytelling will help your organization innovate and grow and build bonds. So,
Yes.
but yeah, how do we do that?
Well, I think the first thing we have to, the organization has to understand is that making sure that they are creating or cultivating a space in which you can actually open up and talk about mental health. Because if it is taboo, if it is visualized as taboo, then I think that's the first thing. So it's being open to having, seminars and learning opportunities and those kinds of things to learn more about it. That's sort of the first forward-facing thing that an employment or an organization can do. The other thing to start looking at as well is that, they say that actions speak louder than words. So a lot of times, if there are behaviors in the environment that are counterproductive, so the chastising of others, the talk of others that may be off on leave and those kinds of things, it's to really sort of cut the feet off of that from the beginning. It's to really challenge that and to not accept mental health bullying. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, those kinds of things. So we also have to show that we're also an environment in which we don't tolerate those types of behaviors as well, right? And then being able to have things in place, policies, procedures that are helpful for people that might be struggling. So if it's, mental health days, if it's, being able, to have that leave, being able to have, employee assistance programs in which they can have access to therapists, but, and those types of things, and having that ability to come back and prepare, the team for that person coming back, that also again is conducive for them to, to know that I'm coming back into a safe space and I'm not going to be chastised as a result of it. So there's certain things I think that can be done built in tandem that will be able to provide that ability for safety and being able to share stories in a increasingly comfortable. It's not going to be comfortable, period.
Of course,
but increasingly comfortable environment.
Okay, we had to pause the podcast to let you in on this opportunity. If you're ready to elevate your brand storytelling, don't miss our training, Tell Better Stories, led by me, a seasoned television journalist and PR professor, and Kyle, an on-air meteorologist and video storytelling expert. This workshop unveils our secrets to craft compelling, personal-driven narratives that resonate with your audience. Learn our distinct approach that puts people first and brands second, leveraging 6 storytelling elements for maximum impact. Walk away with actionable strategies, tactics, and a clear process to replicate success in any organization. Check out the show notes to learn more about this offer or reach out to homeplacecreative@gmail.com.
And this has happened a lot to me, Dr. Natasha, personally since 2020. And so I'm somebody who studies words. I'm a rhetorician and a writer. And so, and failing was hard for me. But I'm curious to know your advice about how do we connect or storytell? How do stories potentially help us connect with people whose value systems, whose cultures, whose experiences are vastly different than ours?
And I think that that's an excellent question, and it may not necessarily have an easy answer, right?
Okay,
because so and the reason I even go there is because there has to be a culture of respect, even if there's differences. right? So
Yes.
that to me, I think is the most important thing. I may have a different value system from the next person, but it doesn't mean that that is an open doorway to disrespect the other person.
Mm,
And that's where you'll start to notice that when we talk about that safety and being able to story tell, that may not be the environment for you to tell your story if the person is coming from a place of absolute disrespect. I may have different values. That's just fine. But I have then, cultivated a space. My hope is that I've cultivated a space in which I will listen more and talk less.
mhm.
That's sort of one of the ways to sort of cultivate that. And if we can agree to disagree, that's fine too, right? But being able to say that right from the onset. But some people may not have the capacity to do so. And that's why I said right at the beginning, it may be tough if it's not only just that we have different value systems, but then you have someone that holds a value system that also disrespects other values.
Yeah,
And that's where we have to really start to be mindful and say, maybe this is not the space, this is not the person, and that's okay too.
absolutely. Have you been in situations or had situations with clients where are there any ways to tell, like, I mean, I know you know this, but just for people who have like the bleeding hearts and really want to connect with others and really try, are there, I know everybody's probably gonna have their own personal boundaries about this,
Mm,
but ways to kind of discern disrespect or for people to know like, hey, are there any signs like this person is not, it's never gonna work? You're.
right. Yeah, and you use the word boundaries, and I think that actually is one of the things that I really look at when we start to talk about not only being able to storytell, but to sort of claim back your own agency. So very interestingly, I talk about not only setting boundaries, but the maintenance of boundaries is also very important because some people may set boundaries. You'll notice that if you start to set boundaries, but you have then individuals in your life that are always testing your boundaries,
Yeah,
right?
we all
And
have them.
right, right, exactly. So they continue to test the boundaries because they're basically trying to see when you're going to crack because the boundaries no longer serve them. That's the issue. And
Mhm.
if I can break those boundaries and get back to a place of comfort for myself at the expense of the other person, then I'm fine. So it comes from a sense of selfishness, right? So if you're now noticing that I've put certain boundaries in place in terms of whom I'll speak with or whom I'll spend my time with or whatever, and you notice that this person, doesn't respect that, is always trying to go outside of that, then you know whom the boundaries were set for because you knew that that individual was either toxic, wasn't serving you well, those kinds of things. And if that person continues to do so, those are where some of the hard decisions have to be made. Because I always say the maintenance of boundaries is also about communicating those boundaries. I've told you that this is what is going to be important for me. My hope is that you respect it. If they continue not to respect it, then the next decision is what is this individual? We'll use that as an example. What does this individual serve in my life? And is it now time to maybe cut those ties and move forward?
Mhm.
Because where I'm going or where I want to be psychologically, emotionally, physically does not align with this person any longer. And those are some hard decisions that we have to make. But what happens is now it's prioritizing your health and well-being versus always trying to please others.
I see storytelling. When I see storytelling, sometimes storytelling is uncomfortable, especially
Mm,
if it's someone who does not hold my value system or isn't from my culture. I'm just not comfortable. But I also believe that I have had some really incredibly rich experiences with people when they have sort of let that wall down and I've let my wall down, and there's such a beautiful, it's so beautiful when you can see
it
things from
is.
a perspective that I could never have because
Yep,
I did not walk life that way. That was not my, but it's
right.
when you can come to the table and you can share those and I'm sure you've seen this happen in your life.
Oh, absolutely.
Do you know what?
Absolutely.
So, and then but then there's, as you mentioned, there's the times where you take those chances and you pour your heart out, you share your raw story, and somebody, like you said, is toxic or
Mhm.
y- does not value that or uses it against you. And
Yep,
so,
yeah.
yeah, like, do you have advice about how to stay open in this environment or to allow give people to, I
Mm.
guess, like give them that advice that like I know when you be vulnerable, when you're vulnerable and you live like that, there you are just kind of gonna get burnt. But there
Right,
is the possibility of also that beautiful connection. And I guess
right.
like I'm willing to get burnt a little bit sometimes because I've seen the value of the flip side.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, then basically what you're saying is exactly it. It's being able to say that, well, let's put it this way. When it comes to vulnerability and, having that ability to say, I'm going to, bring down my walls, I'm going to open up and share because at this point in time, with all the evidence I have around me, this person might seem to be the
That's
person to do that with.
yeah.
If I get burned, I want to acknowledge that pain, but I
Mm,
also want to say that that pain is specific
mm,
versus generalized. Now, the reason I say that is because, if you use an example of, sort of a partner or that kind of thing, and you were vulnerable with that partner, that husband, that wife, whomever, and then you feel that you've been either burned or betrayed or whatever. I want to learn lessons from that specific moment versus generalizing to all,
oh,
right? So
yeah.
what happens is that when you start to bring that baggage into next relationship, you basically now said, because I was burned over here, everyone now has to pay for this person's sins.
Mm,
Where now what I want to do is I want to acknowledge the hurt. I want to acknowledge the pain. There's always these times for grief and mourning, but I also want to be very specific in terms of this is what happened over here,
mm.
right? With this individual and with this person. This next person, friend, or whatever should not be paying for the sins of the other. Right. And if they are, you may then have to take a step back because you may not necessarily be ready to engage in that next friendship or relationship because you have to adequately deal with that baggage that you might be or that hurt that you're carrying over from that other individual. So it's always looking at making sure that we don't generalize. And because what we do is we end up carrying our trauma with us and the story with us.
Oh, that's such beautiful advice. Thank you so much. Yeah, about healing and staying
Right.
open to the possibility of that deep connection that we can have with others. And I also wanted to get your advice today. I want to make sure we have time to get your advice for this because when I looked at your website, I saw that one of the things that you help people do is reclaim their voices. And in I read that it's like reclaim your story.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so,
yeah,
yeah, I was curious, like, what is the advice that you give to people to step into that? And we're sort of getting there, right? As we talk about sharing and
yes.
staying open and vulnerable. But yeah, what's your advice? Do you have like any top pieces of advice to getting back to that reclamation?
Right. Well, I think the first thing that I look at when we start talking about reclaiming your voice is taking that time for introspection for self. So it is a bit of a separation and then coming back,
Uh-huh.
because a lot of times our stories are so involved with other people. When you
As we've
talk
been,
about the
yep.
people pleasing and stuff like that we were talking about before, a lot of times our stories are so woven in that we lose our sense of self
Yep.
in the weaving of those stories. So the one way to reclaim is to take that step back. I'm not talking about complete self-isolation, but it's just enough to step back to really start to figure without those pieces in play, who am I really? Right? If I'm not hosting a dinner or going out with a friend or whatever, if I can sit with myself, what is it about myself that brings me joy? That's the first space. And the thing is, what I do when we start to reclaim those stories, I ask clients to look for the small things that bring them joy. Is it a favorite meal? Is it looking at the sunrise? Whatever. So some of those smaller things we take for granted, but those are the things that we can then embody within ourselves to sort of make our heart leap, make our spirit, those kinds of things. That's the first piece. If we're unable to do that, then being able to engage in any kind of relationship, friendship, intimate relationship or otherwise will come from a deficit position because we're so focused on others.
Hmm.
The people pleasing. My heart bleeds for everyone and I have to help everyone. The helping of everybody is not the problem. It's whom you're giving your gifts to. Right. So when you understand what your gifts are, I can give them out. But if I notice that you're abusing them or not, you're not cherishing them freely, I can take them right back and say, you were not deserving of that. And you know what? Either on to the next, but I know that they're mine. So it's that introspection first, before we even get to the space of how do we then, embody this, embody that with others. But we have to reclaim for self. And a lot of it is what brings you joy, what brings you peace, what makes your heart leap, what makes you smile. And what are those things that you can do for yourself? It's the relationship with self is first before we even talk about relationship with others.
Oh, I love that. And I love the practicality of that. I love the simplicity of now, simple, not easy. Dr. Natasha is what I would say there.
Right. Very
But
true.
yeah, wow. Like how have you seen, and I don't know if you have any stories to tell us, but how does that reclamation of your voice and your story change your lives? And then, as you mentioned, the people who are the recipients of the gifts that you have to give.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that I think, the way that I, ask people to reclaim is that I had to do it for myself first. So even though I have all these years of clinical experience and stuff like that, I had gone through a pretty rough time as well, where, the bottom fell out of my marriage, for example, where I thought everything was going well, and then, infidelity, infertility, like a whole slew of things, and the bottom literally fell out, where I had to file for divorce. Or I chose to file for divorce. And in that separation, after, knowing somebody, we were married for just under 10 years, but I knew him for another 10. So believing I knew that person for 20 years, but the absolute betrayal, I was beside myself. So, the separation for me was I left and I said I needed we call it a come to Jesus moment. But for me, it was literally, I need to separate myself for this, because my whole life had been in service of his family, my family. I was always the go-to. You're the psychologist, so you're the one that should be able to fix all of this. So I was the go-to for everyone. And part of my story embodied that. Well, because I am, this is what embodies my own personal story. I had to take a step back. So when I removed myself from that situation and took time to reflect, I started doing things, for example, that really just brought me joy. Traveling on my own, for example, those solo travel spaces, and being able to, sit at a restaurant on my own, or just being able to, again, figure out what is it that brought me joy versus my story primarily being told through the lens of she helped this person, she helps that person. So being able to do that and start that healing process, where I was able then to really look at whom were my safe spaces, whom were the ones that I had to cut, right? So that was also part of the process as well. There were other people around that were also very toxic. And I had to make those hard decisions. Well, all the decisions were hard, but then you have to choose which hard, right? So I did all of that, and being able to, come out of the other end of that with, very solid relationships, very solid friendships, and having the courage to actually engage in a new relationship, and being able to see that come forth for me, and be with someone whom, the person I'm with now it was actually my first boyfriend. We actually reconnected after 20 years.
Wow.
But still being open and vulnerable enough to receive that, I had to be ready for that, versus am I now taking the baggage from my marriage and then possibly losing out on that opportunity, right? But being able to be healed enough to say, this person has come back in my life. How are we going to work this? What is that going to look like for us? And how are we then going to tell a new story, right? That to me was huge, versus reliving the old story. So all of that put together, I think, was being able to go through that. So now what I do now is I look at my own personal experience, my faith, but also all the clinical research and knowledge that we have, put that all together, and I bring those forth for other people, hopefully, to heal as well.
I love that. Thank you for sharing your story with us and giving us that what precious and like wonderful advice. Thank you so much. With that being said, is there any other advice that you have for people? Kind of maybe they heard you say that and they'd had a similar experience, or they know that they have baggage. And I guess any final thoughts for us on reclaiming our stories and being able to go out into the world as who we are.
Yeah. Your story right now is not your final story. I think that for me is huge. There's more story to tell. When you think you're at the end, there is more story, and we have every right to rewrite that story as often as we want. And that's where the true healing comes in, that you're not a finished product.
I love that. Thank you. What a great way to wrap up. I do have a couple rapid fire questions, but before I get to those, Dr. Natasha, can you tell listeners how they can connect with you or potentially hire you? You mentioned you do training and
Oh,
yeah,
sure. Sure. So you can connect with me several ways. I have a website, so it's www.drnatashawilliams.com. I'm also on social media, so I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on TikTok. So you can definitely catch me at a lot of those areas as well. And it's really under Dr. Natasha Williams, so you'll be able to find
perfect.
me in all those avenues as well.
That's great. We'll link those in the show notes so people can just click there too if they want to find you quick. But that's
Beautiful.
excellent. Thank you so much. So our rapid fire questions are, what is your favorite story of all time? Whether that's a movie, a song, a book, a poem.
Oh my gosh.
No, it's a hard
Ooh.
one.
That's a good one. You know what? It's a book, and it's coming to it. I can't believe it's coming to me now. Uh, the book, The Book of Negroes.
Hmm.
And I read that book. I remember looking at that book, looking at how thick it was, and I'm like, oh, this is going to be a read. But I think the reason why I thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed it, and it really spoke to me, was because of how it wove Canadian Black history
Hmm.
into the character's story. So it helped me to get a deeper understanding, not only just of my history, because I'm born and raised here, but again, a lot of times Black history is coming through the lens of American, which again is not a problem. And we
Hmm.
sometimes don't understand our own, Canadian history. So I remember
Sure.
in reading that, I was like, oh, this is really, really intriguing. So amazing reading. That was something I read years ago, but it did have a profound impact.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that and also mentioning that the storyteller and the lens through which the story is being told is not right. I like to say like not right or wrong, but also important for us to be aware of as we come into contact with stories, right?
Yes,
Certainly. So thank
absolutely.
you for that reminder. And then the second question is, do you have any advice, you could do either or here, but advice about storytelling that is so great, you just want everybody to know, or so terrible, you would like to warn people about it?
Oh my goodness.
Either
Yes,
one, or
yes,
both,
yes,
whatever you want to do.
yes, yes. I think what I would say is do not give other people so much power to tell your entire story.
Hmm.
I think that's what we do a lot. And again, it might start with parents, but then it starts with, it could continue with either friends or spouse or, those types of things. And we give them so much power. It's like we've given them the pen, we give them the paper and say, hey, can you write our story, please?
Mm,
Where they can be a contributor, but they don't have to be the primary author.
absolutely. Awesome advice. And then the last question is, how would you define storytelling in your own words?
Hmm. Oh man. Oh, that is such a great question. In my own words, I think storytelling is my life script. I'd keep it short and simple. It's my life script, so that means it is always evolving, and the story's ever evolving.
What a great note to end on and an inspiring one, Dr. Natasha. This has been such a blessing to me in my day. Like, thank you so much for
Oh,
taking the time. Like, it was a lovely conversation. And yeah, I'm just so grateful for you.
thank you. I appreciate it. This is such a great way to really look at, the work that we do as well.
We're so glad you've listened to this podcast episode. If you liked it, would you mind doing us a favor? Share this episode with someone who would be interested in the topic too. We're on a mission to help everyone become a better storyteller. And don't forget to subscribe to the show to get updated every time we release a new episode. Each and every episode is produced, hosted, and edited by us, Meg and Kyle Adams at Home Place Creative. Happy storytelling!